Welcome back to Creepy Corner Stories, where the mundane becomes the macabre and the everyday turns into the eerie. Tonight, we're heading to a place most of us know all too well, the gas station. It's a simple stop for fuel, snacks, or a late-night coffee, but in the shadows of the fluorescent lights, something sinister often lurks. From unexplainable encounters on desolate highways to chilling confessions heard over the hum of gas pumps, these stories will make you think twice before pulling into the next station. So buckle up, because tonight we're diving into gas station horror stories that will have you looking over your shoulder every time you stop for a fill-up. Let's begin. Story: The Night Shift. In a small, sleepy town nestled between sprawling forests and endless highways, there stood an old gas station. It was the kind of place travelers stopped at only when their fuel gauges hit empty. Its flickering neon sign barely visible against the pitch-black backdrop of the surrounding woods. Jenny, a college student trying to make ends meet, had recently taken the night shift at the gas station. The hours were long, the customers sparse, and the air always carried an unsettling quietness. But the pay was decent, and Jenny figured she could handle a few uneventful nights. One particular night, around 2 a.m., the station was eerily still. Even the occasional trucker hadn't shown up. Jenny sat behind the counter, scrolling through her phone, when the faint hum of a car engine broke the silence. A rusted, beat-up sedan pulled into the lot. The driver, a man in his late 40s, with disheveled hair and a shadowy beard, stepped out. Jenny watched as he slowly pumped gas, his movements deliberate, almost too slow. Something about him felt off. The man finished pumping and walked toward the store. As he entered, the bell above the door let out a sharp chime, startling Jenny. He didn't grab any snacks or drinks. Instead, he strolled straight to the counter, his eyes locked on hers. "Quiet night, huh?" he said, his voice gravelly. "Yeah, pretty quiet," Jenny replied, trying to sound casual. He leaned on the counter, a little too close for comfort. "You work here alone?" Jenny felt her stomach tighten. Something in his tone made her uneasy. She forced a polite smile and avoided answering directly. "It's usually pretty slow at this hour." The man didn't move. He stared at her for a moment, his eyes scanning the room. Then, almost as if he'd read her mind, he said, "I bet it gets lonely out here. A young girl all by herself." Jenny's heart raced. She decided to end the conversation. "Can I help you with anything else?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. He grinned, a crooked, unsettling grin, and shook his head. "Nah, just passing through." With that, he turned and left, the doorbell chiming again as he stepped outside. Jenny let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She watched as the man got into his car, but he didn't leave. Instead, he parked at the far end of the lot, his headlights off. Minutes passed. Jenny tried to focus on her phone, but her eyes kept darting to the car. It was still there, the silhouette of the man barely visible inside. The phone on the counter rang, making her jump. She picked it up, her voice shaking. "Hello?" No one answered, but she could hear breathing, slow, deliberate breathing. Her stomach dropped. "Who is this?" she demanded. A low chuckle echoed through the receiver before the line went dead. Jenny's hands trembled as she hung up. She debated calling the police, but didn't want to overreact. Maybe it was just a prank, maybe the man had left. But when she glanced outside, the car was gone. She felt a wave of relief until she saw something that made her blood run cold. The man was standing at the edge of the woods, staring directly at her. She scrambled to lock the doors, her hands shaking as she turned the key. The man didn't move. He just stood there, partially hidden in the shadows. Jenny grabbed her phone and called the police, explaining the situation as calmly as she could. The dispatcher assured her that an officer was on the way. Minutes felt like hours as she waited, her eyes glued to the man outside. But then, he was gone. When the police arrived, they searched the area but found no trace of the man. They escorted Jenny home, promising to keep an eye on the station. The next morning, the station manager called her, his voice grim. "Jenny, you might want to come down here," he said. She drove to the station, her anxiety mounting. The manager led her to the back of the building, where the security cameras had captured footage of the previous night. As Jenny watched, her stomach turned. The camera showed the man inside the store talking to her, But what they hadn't seen was what happened before he entered. The footage revealed him circling the building, peering into the windows, and standing by the back door, trying to force it open. Jenny quit the job that day and never looked back. But to this day, she can't shake the feeling that the man is still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for his next opportunity. Story: The Passenger. It was a cold, foggy night on a desolate highway when Mark, a truck driver on a long-haul trip, realized he was running low on fuel. The glowing sign of a gas station appeared in the distance, flickering through the mist like a beacon. Relieved, Mark pulled into the station, its isolation making it feel more like an eerie relic than a modern convenience. The station was small and empty, save for a single attendant inside the dimly lit building. As Mark filled his tank, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He glanced around, but saw no one. The fog seemed to press against the edges of the parking lot, swallowing the surrounding forest in an opaque wall. Mark finished pumping gas and decided to grab a coffee to keep himself awake. Inside, the attendant, a wiry man with sunken eyes, barely looked up from his newspaper as Mark entered. "Quiet night," Mark said, trying to make conversation. The attendant nodded without a word, his expression unreadable. As Mark paid for his coffee, he felt it again, that unsettling sensation of being watched. He glanced toward the large glass windows at the front of the store, but the fog was so thick he could barely see his truck. "You heading out soon?" the attendant asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Mark nodded. "Yeah, still have a long way to go." The man hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Be careful out there. Strange things happen on this stretch of road." Mark chuckled nervously. "Yeah? Like what?" The attendant didn't answer. Instead, he just stared at Mark, his eyes dark and serious. Shrugging off the eerie encounter, Mark returned to his truck, his boots crunching against the gravel. He climbed into the cab, set his coffee in the cup holder, and turned the ignition. The truck roared to life, and Mark pulled back onto the highway, the fog swallowing him once again. He'd been driving for about 20 minutes when he glanced in his rearview mirror. His blood ran cold. There, in the backseat of his cab, sat a figure, a woman, her face pale and emotionless, her eyes locked on his in the reflection. Mark swerved, nearly driving off the road before slamming on the brakes. Story: The Payphone Caller. Late one evening, Lisa was driving home from visiting her parents in the countryside. The winding back roads stretched endlessly, the only light coming from her car's high beams and the faint glow of the moon. She had been on the road for hours and decided to stop at the first gas station she saw. Eventually, a small, run-down station appeared on the side of the road. Its single neon "open" sign buzzed faintly, flickering every few seconds. The place seemed deserted, but Lisa was too tired to care. She pulled up to the pump, turned off her engine, and got out. As she filled her tank, she noticed a payphone mounted on the side of the building. It was an old, weathered payphone, the kind you don't see much anymore. What caught her attention was that the receiver was dangling, swaying slightly as if someone had just used it. Lisa glanced around. There were no other cars, and the station was completely still. Uneasy, she tried to shrug it off and finished pumping her gas. As she walked toward the station to pay, the payphone began to ring. Lisa froze. The sharp, shrill sound echoed in the quiet night. She stared at the phone, her heart pounding. Who could possibly be calling a payphone in the middle of nowhere? The ringing continued. Against her better judgment, she approached the phone and picked up the receiver. "Hello?" she said hesitantly. At first, there was nothing but static. Then, a voice, a low, raspy whisper. "You shouldn't be here." Lisa's breath caught in her throat. "Who is this?" The voice didn't answer. Instead, it repeated the same chilling phrase, "You shouldn't be here." Before she could respond, the line went dead. Lisa hung up the phone, her hands trembling. She rushed inside the station to pay. The cashier, an older man with a grizzled beard, looked up from his magazine as she entered. "Everything okay?" he asked, noticing her pale face. "Who's outside using the payphone?" Lisa demanded. The cashier frowned. "Nobody's used that phone in years. It doesn't even work. Lines have been dead since the 90s. Lisa felt her stomach drop, but it just rang. Someone called, and I... The cashier interrupted her, his face darkening. "Miss, are you sure you're not imagining things? This place can play tricks on you late at night." She shook her head and paid for her gas, her mind racing. As she left the station, she glanced at the payphone one last time. The receiver was hanging again, swaying gently in the still night air. Lisa got in her car and sped away, vowing never to stop at another isolated gas station again. But for the rest of the drive, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching her from the shadows. Story: The Vanishing Hitchhiker. Jason had been driving through the desert for hours, the endless stretch of road blending into the dark horizon. He was on his way to a new job in a distant city, and the solitude of the trip was starting to weigh on him. The gas gauge on his car dipped into the red, and relief washed over him when he saw the faint glow of a gas station sign ahead. The station was a lonely outpost, surrounded by nothing but sand and darkness. Jason pulled in, parking by the pumps. The station seemed abandoned. No other cars, no attendants in sight. A single flickering bulb illuminated the lot. As he stepped out of his car, he noticed a woman standing by the side of the building. She was young, pale, and dressed in a thin, tattered sundress. Her hair hung in messy strands over her face. Jason hesitated. She wasn't there when he drove in, and the vast emptiness of the desert made her sudden appearance unsettling. "Hey," he called out, "are you okay?" The woman didn't respond at first. She just stared at him, her eyes wide and glassy. Then, in a quiet, trembling voice, she said, "I need a ride." Jason glanced around. There were no other signs of life for miles. "Where are you headed?" "Just down the road," she said, pointing vaguely into the darkness. Jason felt a pang of unease. Something about her didn't sit right, but he couldn't just leave her there. "All right," he said reluctantly, "I'll take you." The woman climbed into the passenger seat of his car without a word. Her presence was unsettling. She sat stiffly, staring straight ahead, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Jason tried to make conversation. "So what were you doing out here?" She didn't answer. "Do you live nearby?" he asked, glancing at her. Still nothing. The silence was suffocating, and Jason's nerves were starting to fray. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, his eyes darting between the road and the woman. After about 10 minutes, she finally spoke. "You need to stop," she said, her voice low and urgent. Jason frowned. "Stop here?" "Yes, now." Reluctantly, Jason pulled over to the side of the road. The woman turned to him for the first time, her eyes filled with a strange mix of fear and sadness. "Thank you," she whispered. Then, before Jason could react, she opened the door and stepped out into the night. He watched as she walked into the darkness, her figure fading into the desert. "Wait," he called out, but she didn't stop. Jason sat there for a moment, unsure of what to do. Eventually, he got out and walked a few steps into the darkness, but there was no sign of her. It was as if she had vanished. Shaking his head, Jason returned to his car, chalking it up to exhaustion and the strange isolation of the desert. But as he started the engine, his eyes drifted to the rearview mirror, and his heart stopped. There in the back seat sat the woman, her eyes wide and unblinking, her lips curled into a faint, chilling smile. Jason didn't remember much after that. He woke up the next morning in his car, parked at the same gas station where he had picked her up. The attendant tapped on his window, startling him awake. "Hey, you okay?" the man asked. "You've been out here all night." Jason nodded weakly, his mind racing. He looked into the back seat. It was empty. He never saw the woman again, but he avoided that stretch of desert for the rest of his life. Thank you for joining me tonight on Creepy Corner Stories, where we've delved into the haunting tales of gas station encounters gone wrong. These stories remind us that even the most mundane stops can hide the darkest secrets. So the next time you pull into a lonely station on a dark, empty road, take a moment to look around. You never know what or who might be watching. Until next time, stay safe, stay vigilant, and keep the lights on. Sweet dreams, everyone.